Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. I'm your host, J.R. Keller, and I'm an associate professor and faculty director of the Executive Masters in Human Resource Management program at the Cornell ILR School. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Rebecca Kehoe, who is a professor at the Cornell ILR School and the author of an article published in the Harvard Business Review called The Case for Hiring Job Hoppers, co-authored by Rebecca and Scott Bentley. Welcome, Rebecca. Today's keynote comes to you as a result of a production partnership between the Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies, the Cornell ILR School, and the team here at eCornell. Viewers, we'd like to hear from you today, and we'll take your questions. Please submit them in the chat. And heads up for resources, tools, and links to several online courses that I have authored in the chat as well. Okay, let's get into it. Rebecca, you just wrote one of the most provocative HBR articles that I've read in a long time, titled The Case for Job Hoppers, which was also recently featured in the Wall Street Journal. Can you tell us a bit about the research itself and what you found?
Yeah, so in this research, we studied hedge fund managers. We looked at their career histories, their patterns of mobility between organizations, and their monthly performance patterns in every organization they worked at. And essentially what we were interested in is what happens when these managers transition between organizations, right? So we know from decades of research that employees tend to experience a drop in performance when they change firms, right? You've got to come in, you're going into a new context, you got to figure out how things work, who do I need to know, how do things get done around here. What we did in this research was examine the pattern in mobility between organizations to ask the question, do we gain something, or do fund managers gain something from the experience of transitioning into different organizations? So that drop in performance, when I join a new firm, right, is that drop smaller if I have more experience joining new firms previously? So the idea is that in addition to the challenge that you experience when you come into a new context and come up to speed, it's also a learning opportunity. You're learning how to navigate a new context. You're learning how to meet new colleagues, figure out how things work in a new space, in a new environment. So if I do that once, I know how to do that in one environment. If I do it twice, now I've seen it a couple different places. If I keep doing it, now I'm getting the skill that I can bring with me as I join new organizations. We talk about kind of a generalizable or portable skill that you develop, that you bring with you. So basically what we find is the more that you've moved around previously, the more quickly you come up to speed when you join a new company.
So it's like you develop a skill for joining new organizations.
Yeah, it's really a skill related to adaptability in that mobility context.
That's fascinating. So are there particular contexts where job hoppers might have an advantage? For example, are they better positioned or not as well positioned than their less mobile new hires to navigate workplaces with strong cultures?
Yeah, so we did examine kind of when is this benefit going to be stronger, right? So just to give you a baseline, what we found was that on average, what we call job hoppers, those more mobile managers, they took about 2 months to get up to speed when they joined a new company. Whereas less mobile managers took about 5 months. So this is a huge measurable difference. Yeah. This advantage was even stronger first when they're joining companies with stronger cultures. And the idea here is you can imagine a stronger culture where people are kind of more set on the way that we do things around here, right? They might have their guard up a little bit when it comes to newcomers. They want to protect the status quo, right? They're comfortable with the way things have been, and so they're going to be a little bit resistant to new ideas, new perspectives. That's harder to break through for a newcomer. People who've moved around more have a better sense of how to kind of delicately navigate those contexts to break through those social barriers. We also found that this benefit was stronger for managers that were joining more collaborative roles. So we looked at managers joining funds that were co-managed versus funds that they were managing solo. And the idea here is you're co-managing, or in a broader context, if we think about other types of jobs, if you're in a collaborative role, you have to work with your colleagues. You can't kind of put up your blinders and say, I'm just going to do things the way I want. So you're kind of forced to navigate that social context, whether you want to or not. You're thrown in a little more quickly. So that's another context where job hoppers' benefit was even stronger. And then one final one was where among newcomers joining roles or joining organizations that were kind of a big jump, like quite different from the types of organizations they'd worked at previously. And the idea here is anytime you join a new organization, it's a shock, right?
Yeah.
New colleagues, new space, new way of doing things. The more novelty, the more newness that you're dealing with, the bigger the shock. But if I'm more adaptable at overcoming shocks, overcoming novelty, that big shock is less jolting for me.
So that's so interesting. And I think in some ways it really flips what we might think of as a job hopper stigma on its head. I think typically we think of job hoppers as less committed. Maybe they're leaving because they're not as good, but there's something generally negative, I think, that we have tended to associate, or managers tend to associate when they look at a resume. So I'm sort of, given that you're flipping this on its head, what's the first thing you'd want a hiring manager to consider when they see a resume with, say, 5 employers in 8 years?
Yeah, so the first thing I would want them to do is not chuck the resume in the trash, which is what we see hiring managers do, right? There's a stigma around job hopping. So that's my first priority. But beyond that, it's really taking a step back and saying, what might this person have gained from these different experiences? And then reflecting on the role that I'm hiring for. Is this a role where I might benefit from bringing someone in who's going to adapt quickly, who's going to come up to speed and kind of integrate efficiently and effectively with the people around them? Because in those cases, job hoppers might not be a bad hire, they might be a really good hire.
Okay, so it's so interesting, and I'm thinking about like what this looks like. So can you paint a picture of what a highly mobile newcomer is doing or might be doing in their first week that sort of somebody who's less mobile might not?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we should take stock of is that every newcomer, what's going on in their first week is they're coming in and they're saying, whoa, what did I just get into, right? Again, new environment, new office, new colleagues, new culture, everything's new. What's different is how they respond, right? So more mobile managers are coming in and they say, okay, whoa, everything's new. Is less of a jolt because I've done this before, first. But second, I know what to do with this. I know how to get my hands around this. I know what I don't know. That's something I think that's worth highlighting. It's not that job hoppers know any better the new culture or the new colleagues. They're coming in with just as much kind of newness or novelty as anyone else. It's that they have a sense of, okay, I know certain things are unique to each organization, and these are the things I need to figure out, and I have a sense of how to figure them out. So one way to think about this is if you've spent your career in one organization, you're going to internalize the way of doing things that you're familiar with from that organization. So you think, this is how I get traction for new ideas. This is how I gain influence. This is how I can disagree without alienating a room, right?
Yeah.
If you assume when you join a new organization that you can just apply those same principles to the new context, you could be sorely mistaken.
And we've seen research that shows that,
We
right?
have seen this.
You kind of have to unlearn your old organization.
There's this element of unlearning, and that's another thing that we talk about job hoppers doing. It's not just that they're better able to learn, they're better able to unlearn. So they're better able to take all of those lessons that served them so well in their last organization and to set them aside and say, I need to figure out what's going to work in this organization. I understand that this organization may be different from my last experience or my last 2 or 3 experiences. I haven't internalized one organization's way of doing things as the way of doing things. I recognize that's one way of doing things that's suitable for that context, and that I need to figure out the way of doing things here.
Okay, so that's all so interesting, right? And I do like the idea of like reframing the way managers think about this, and then maybe managers understanding the value that this is the skill that job hoppers bring. But there is still sometimes a stigma, right? So it's hard to get rid of this. Maybe this research will help, right, eliminate that to some extent. But I'm curious if, sort of given what you found, if you might have any advice for folks listening or watching with us, or just in general on how job seekers who have moved around a bit might talk about or reframe their previous experiences. Let's say, for example, someone's sitting down for an interview and get asked, why have you moved around so much? Why have you had 5 jobs in the last 8 years?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll say is be honest, right? This isn't about hiding anything. It's more about taking control of the narrative. So it's a little bit of answering the question that you that you wanted them to ask. You could talk about what you've gained, right? Which isn't directly answering the question of why you've moved, but it's reframing the moves and what's associated with them in terms of the learning, right? What I've learned as I've moved is how to adapt to a new context, how to come in and figure out how things work, how to fit in with a new group of colleagues. I've also learned where I fit in. You could make the case that as I've joined more organizations, I've seen that things are very different in each context, and I've gotten a better sense of where I might be a better fit as well and where I'm likely to thrive. So it's not about being deceitful, right? Yeah. But taking control of the narrative and framing it around that learning. Here's what I'm now better able to do, having moved 5 times relative to my first job. Right, yeah. I can pick up and come into a new context more effectively.
I think it's a very genuine, authentic way of answering that question, right? And Alan asked a related question. How do we operationalize adaptability signals in a structured interview? Are there specific, so if you're a manager, are there specific interview questions or assessment criteria that you'd recommend to actually sort of distinguish genuine adaptability from someone who's just moved around a lot?
Yeah, so I think some of it is asking about what did you get out of these moves? Tell me about your transitions between organizations. You could even ask something that's more particular to the context that you're working in, right? About how quickly did it take you to recover this performance loss? Or we expect employees to take a drop in performance when they switch organizations. How quickly did it take you to come back up to speed? Or you could ask it in kind of a more qualitative sense. So how do you go about joining a new group of colleagues? What are the kinds of questions that you ask when you join an organization? What are the things that you would want to know when you come in and start a new job? Getting a sense of someone's thinking gives you some insight into how they're approaching that learning and how well equipped they are to actually come in and adapt.
So I think that's really useful. That's very similar, right, to how we tend to think about behavioral interview questions. Ask them about a situation, but here it's a really clear question about adaptability and coming into a new organization. Okay, so I have a few more. We have a few audience questions coming in, but I want to hold on those for a minute until they fit in. So you study this in the context of U.S. hedge fund managers. So I want to ask you a couple questions about that. First is, you talked about performance gains, performance dips. How'd you measure performance?
We're looking at the returns on their portfolios. So this is the fund returns. So how much are they making on their investments?
That's about as objective as
it's a pretty objective measure, yeah.
Okay. I am wondering how confident you are that this sort of, this story, the mobility builds adaptation skills, holds up in different contexts. Maybe sort of a more bureaucratic organization, hospital, unionized manufacturing plant, just the generalizability.
Yeah, so I'll start with a caveat that's coming, which is more research is needed to see if these findings replicate. But my hunch, my instinct based on our theory and based on the prior research that we've drawn on is that these findings are likely to generalize anywhere where employees are coming in and having to figure out a new way of how things work around here. So if we think about a bureaucratic organization, you hear about people in bureaucratic organizations dealing with red tape and going through layers of management, right? Those are the kinds of things that you can learn how to navigate, right? How do I cut through the red tape in an organization? Yeah. How do I, if I have to deal with layers of management, how do I do that? How do I get the lay of the land to figure out how to not step on toes but get what I need to done? So I think the findings are likely to be quite generalizable to the extent that we're talking about jobs where there's going to be some kind of unique or idiosyncratic way of doing things in a particular organization, which we know is a good number of contexts.
Yeah, I could even think about this in a very different type of job, like a customer service
Absolutely.
role, right? Because you're used to, you're going to deal with a different set of processes, different types of customers, But if you know that you need to kind of learn that customer, learn the processes, you're more likely to get up to speed at the new organization's way of doing things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the thing I would add is this is true particularly to the extent that the way of doing things involves interacting with key stakeholders, whether those stakeholders are other employees, clients, suppliers, right? Anyone that has sort of a history with the organization and an expectation for how you're going to interact, I think these findings are likely to apply.
Okay, so we have a set of questions around, this is definitely touching a nerve. So a lot of questions about, this is super cool, how do we implement this? You know, how do we get managers to think a little bit differently? So Morella asked a question, right? If I wanted to bring this research back to my organization, which is awesome because that's what we always hope, people actually read and listen to our research and do something with it. But if we want to do that to like actually update screening criteria, what might that look like practically? Is that about changing questions on job applications? Is it more retraining recruiters, adjusting how we score resumes? Any thoughts on how you might like change the recruiting process to change the way job hoppers get viewed?
Yeah, so I think this is less, from a screening perspective at that stage, this is less about a basis on which to screen applicants in, right? Oh, we want to screen them in because they're a job hopper.
Okay.
It's more about, at this stage, not screening them out because they're a job hopper. And that's what I think traditionally has happened, right? We chuck the resume in the trash because they've moved around too much, and we think if we hire them, they're just going to leave too.
So you're already assuming like they might have the skills and criteria, but it raises red flags, and so
exactly. So stop looking at it as an immediate red flag in the screening process.
Okay.
Right. Then when it comes to later stages, when you get to interviews, I think that we can ask the question first from a hiring manager perspective. Is there a benefit here that would be useful? Am I hiring for a role where it would be really valuable for someone to be coming up to speed quickly? So training hiring managers to actually think carefully about the roles they're hiring for. The other thing that I'll add that we didn't consider in this research, but I think that from a practical perspective, if we're thinking about more seriously considering job hoppers, everybody wants to know, why did you move 5 times?
Yeah.
Right? Asking that question and actually being open to the answer, not assuming that they left 5 times in 8 years because they weren't a fit or because they're not committed. Maybe there's a good reason. Maybe it was because they weren't a fit, but they recognized it early enough and wanted to move on. Maybe it was for growth opportunities. Who knows the reason, but being open to that answer rather than making assumptions and screening people out on that basis.
Okay. So Audrey has sort of a follow-up question to this, which is, let's say we started prioritizing or at least being more open to considering job offers for certain roles based on this research, right? So whether that's a hedge fund manager or a customer service person, what metrics should an organization be tracking to know if it's actually working? Is it time to productivity, retention, performance reviews? Like, how do you measure quality of hire?
This is a really good question, and it will allow me to highlight what we did find and what we didn't find, what we did and didn't focus on in this research. So our focus in this research was strictly on the level of performance post-hire. So to what extent did your performance drop relative to your performance in your most recent organization? And then how quickly did it take you to come back up to speed? We weren't focused on sort of once you were up to speed, your overall performance, but we did find, just from follow-up analysis, job hoppers don't actually differ from other employees, other newcomers. Once everybody's up to speed, they're comparable. So we're not making the case that job hoppers are better performing employees. They just come up to speed more quickly. So that's one important point.
Can I ask, just to make sure I have this right? So tell me if this makes sense. So if you're looking at a hedge fund manager, right? At the end of the first year, let's say you're doing an annual review and everybody's at like a 3 on a performance review. So it might be that somebody who hasn't job hopped and somebody who's hopped a lot, they both end up at 3. But if you're thinking about like how quickly they get up to that level, it's faster for people who have moved more before. Is that right? Exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I would say, is it working? Is it working is how quickly do they come up to speed? In terms of performance, once performance has kind of come up to speed and plateaued, we expect them to be comparable. In terms of retention, that points to another really important point that's worth highlighting in this discussion. We didn't focus on retention. Prior research has shown that job hoppers are more likely to leave sooner than other employees. And that is the traditional red flag. So we're not suggesting that that's no longer true. That may still be true. What I'll throw in there is that mobility is higher than ever, so everyone's a turnover risk, right?
Yeah,
so maybe we should be focusing on performance for the time you're in the organization. But in terms of is it working, I would say the focus would be on how quickly do they come up to speed.
Okay. So I think maybe, Audrey, one way to think about that is, are there metrics, whether it's sales figures, calls answered, ideally some sort of objective measure that says like how fast do you meet some sort of internal benchmark?
Yeah, a lot of organizations ask during their onboarding and socialization, they'll survey employees about those experiences, and you could kind of compare that as well. We would expect self-reports from employees, from these newcomer employees, to reflect that job hoppers are kind of more comfortable, feeling more adjusted more quickly than other newcomers as well. So that would be another way to look at that.
Okay. So you mentioned that one of the previously shown red flags for job hoppers is that they'll hop again. So they hop into your organization, they're going to hop out of your organization, right? Which, as you said, maybe we don't care about that as much anymore because people are moving around more often and more quickly than they ever have before. Sometimes by choice, sometimes not. Is there any other research or any other red flags that previous work has shown that is associated with job hoppers?
So, whereas previous work has kind of objectively shown that job hoppers are more likely to turn over, more likely to leave, from a more subjective perspective, research has shown that managers, and this kind of reflects that red flag, managers perceive job hoppers, not their actual employees, but just prospective hires who are seen as job hoppers, to be less committed and to have worse work attitudes. So it's not that they're experiencing that from the people they've hired, it's that they're looking at a resume and saying, without even having met this employee, I bet that they're going to be less committed and that they have worse work attitudes than someone who's moved less.
Okay. So it strikes me that we didn't really, we're academics, so we love these clear definitions. We haven't necessarily defined job hopper, right? So there's people who move more versus people who move less. But it does point to these questions around like, is there like a right number? Is there too few? So when should we consider somebody to be a job hopper? When shouldn't we? Maybe another way to put that, like if you had to bet, your data is generally around 6 moves, right, over 20 plus years of experience. Is there a number where you'd consider somebody to be a job hopper or not, or where you might see this effect start to peter out? I feel like I just asked you 6 questions in one. It's kind of around what do we consider a job hopper versus a regularly mobile employee?
So we didn't see any tapering off in our data, but we only had, so many years. What I would say is that when you get to kind of what we might think about as extreme levels of mobility, that could I don't have a number, but that could raise more questions around the why. What's going on? Is it that they're refusing to adapt to a new organization and so they're just moving on before they even bother adapting? Another question is, are they able to actually gain the benefit of learning a new environment in such a short time of being within any given company? So I think those are kind of questions worth asking that could guide the answer to like how much is too much. But then there's also the question, which is a more qualitative question of why are they leaving? And is that reflecting something else that we should know that would be relevant in the hiring decision?
My guess is, and this is me speculating a little bit too, is that when we think of, like for a manager evaluating candidates, that there is some level of like that those norms may vary, right? So in tech, for example, historically people have moved much more quickly than people in more manufacturing or pharmaceuticals. And so it may be sort of industry or even geographic.
Yeah, I mean, you could also look at like labor market trends over a period of time. So I think so much is context dependent on how we should be interpreting and how managers are likely to kind of interpret different patterns of mobility.
So So I have a question. So I love to look at internal mobility, right? So this is looking at people moving
Yeah.
across organizations. I wonder what you would think. Like, we do see a lot of people kind of frequently apply, especially if you're in a large corporation, you might get your foot in the door, that you want to get promoted or you want to move to another division, like you want to continue to build. Do you think that there is like these same patterns might play out inside an organization where the more frequently you move, you get used to changing? Like I'm wondering, might this play out similar or differently inside a company?
Yeah. So this is actually a question I would love to explore in the AMJ, the academic version of the paper where we reported on this research. We talk a little in the discussion about sort of micro transitions within organizations, and the way that I'm thinking about this is that I think it would be really fascinating to know if this is actually a tool that organizations could leverage. So rather than just sort of passively saying, oh, has this employee moved more and do they come up to speed more quickly? If we think about not just like beyond moves between actual kind of formal jobs, but project teams, stretch assignments, can managers leverage this idea by saying, if I strategically place employees into maybe lower stakes mobility contexts where I put them on a project team or a task force repeatedly, is that a way to build their adaptability? So rather than using it as like an evaluative mechanism, like, do I think that you're more adaptable because you've done this? Could we use it, and this is where more research is needed, but could we use this as a mechanism to build adaptability among our own employees? I think this is a really fascinating question that I'd love to explore.
Yeah, anybody working in companies that want to look at that question, let us know. That is a really fascinating question. Okay, I want to switch gears just a little bit. I want to come back kind of to the practical implications in terms of recruiting. So one of the things in recruiting is that it is the area where companies are experimenting the most with AI, right? If you look at the data in terms of investments, talent acquisition, the billions of dollars spent in implementing AI in some way or another. So I could imagine, right, when an enterprising recruiter reading your HBR piece or listening to us today and thinking about how to operationalize this insight, maybe by weighting the number of prior employers so that it can be included in a screening or hiring algorithm, right? So you talked about screening them in, but maybe thinking about, how we would weight this. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on incorporating this into some sort of an algorithm. Does it sound like a good idea? Could it backfire, be used to justify decisions unrelated to the actual mechanisms you're describing? I just feel like everybody wants to take any piece of research, plug it into an algorithm somewhere. What are your thoughts on that?
This feels risky to me.
Okay, yeah.
I think the first thing I'll say is, again, job hoppers aren't better employees, right? So to weight this in the same way that we would weight other criteria that we think is going to make them better in a job overall over time could be problematic. And again, I see it less of a good tool for screening in and more of a stop using this to screen. So don't use an algorithm to screen people out based on prior moves. So that's where that could be relevant. But I don't think it's as simple as hiring for number of prior moves. I think it's like one data point, and it feels just subjective enough that I want a human involved in that decision making.
It does strike me that maybe one way you could think about incorporating this into some sort of algorithm is where you're analyzing your recruiting funnel and who's making it through, say, to the interview stage. And you could note, is it showing that people who have had, like an average tenure of, say, a year or 1.2 years, whatever that might be shorter, are systematically getting screened out, right? Not getting interviewed. And then that could be a way for whether it's the recruiting team or HR business partners to say, let's take a look at some of those and see if they should have been considered. And so almost like, it's almost like an alert, like, hey, reconsider. Like, let's take a look at our pool and see if there is sort of this bias against job hoppers that you're suggesting we shouldn't necessarily have.
Right, yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
Okay. Okay, so you did talk about one thing that you were interested in exploring, right? Kind of looking at this purposeful internal transitions to to build adaptability, kind of these micro transitions. Of all the other follow-up questions, right, around diversity of moves, cross-national transitions, are there any other ones that you're eager to chase next?
Yeah, so one decision that we made really deliberately in this research was to focus exclusively on one job that was a fairly standard role across organizations. And so we did that to kind of parse out all the noise that could muddy kind of findings related to, well, what's really explaining any kind of changes in this performance drop or ramp up when people change organizations. So we kind of focused in on hedge fund managers. We didn't just focus on hedge fund managers. We only focused on hedge fund managers who maintained the role of hedge fund manager in the US hedge fund industry for the duration of our study window, in order to be able to say, these are people who are moving between comparable jobs across organizations where we have a very standardized measure of performance, so we can really compare apples to apples. Because this was kind of a new research question, we wanted to be able to rule out all other, or as many other, explanations for our findings as possible. The reality, as we know, is that this is a small portion of people who stay in kind of a very narrowly defined role in a specific industry over the entire course of their careers. So this increased mobility trend that we see actually is characterized much more by people moving between different types of jobs, often very intentionally to build skills, to build networks. Sometimes they're crossing industries. And so I would really like to see how this plays out for employees who are moving across and between very different kinds of contexts. So on one hand, I think that there is likely to be some kind of common learning that continues to carry over and apply. I join a new context and I have a sense of what I need to learn, of what I don't know. What is less clear, and where I think research kind of is needed to shed light, is there sort of a schema or a framework that's sort of consistent within a single industry that job hoppers are benefiting from when we're moving, say, within the hedge fund industry over the course of years, we know, across different firms?
Because there is some basis of shared knowledge.
There's some kind of sharedness, right?
Yeah.
Versus going to a totally different context where all bets are off. You're in a totally new environment. Maybe there's still that adaptability that they've gained that still helps them to come up to speed more quickly. And that is my sense. I think that there is a more generalizable form of learning that is going to be able to transfer. How much, and how much is kind of totally new, is, I think, where we need more research.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You also wonder, right, then if you would see a pattern where, like, let's say the cross-national moves, right, which are sort of big and multinational, huge organizations, like, it suggests that there is like almost a tremendous value in getting that first experience, because that makes all the other ones easier, and thinking as a employee, when do I want to do that? And is it going to open up doors in the future that might not otherwise be open? Yeah,
so I think to that point, and to the point about kind of moving across industries or very different types of roles, I think there's incredible value in just recognizing that there are different ways that things work in a new context, right? And so whether that's in the same industry, just in a new company, or moving to a different industry, that's where I think there's this sort of transferable skill that we're developing, or moving to a new country, right? I realized that mental model, that mental map that I had of this is how things work, this is the way that you do things, based on my one experience in one organization, that's not just how the world operates. That's how this organization operates. Now, if I move to another context, and maybe another one after that, I start to see I need to unlearn, I need to figure out what's new, and I'm gaining some ability to do that more effectively.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think this is sort of tangential, but related to your work is, when we talk to undergraduates, they generally have no idea what they really want to do, right? They might say, like, I want to do investment banking, or I want to do consulting, but rarely even in an internship do you get a full sense of what that's like. So I think in addition to building these skills for moving, right? You're also getting a sense of like what things look like in different organizations or in different industries. You could feel like you get to learn a little bit about yourself.
Yeah.
Too,
Yeah.
and what you like and what you want to do, or what you
Yeah.
don't like, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so, in addition to this study, you recently edited and published a new open access ebook. It's called The Age of HR, Delivering Stakeholder Value Through Strategic Organizational Capability, Talent, Leadership, and Culture. One of the longest ebook titles ever, but a very good one. But we're making this available for our audience to download and read. Anything you want to say about that book? I think it's quite
So this
cool.
was a fun project, and you contributed as well, right? So this is co-edited with Anthony Nyberg, Dave Ulrich, and Pat Wright. And really the idea behind the book is the world of work is in this period of maybe not turmoil, upheaval, substantial change, right? With changes in technology, AI, geopolitical, I will say turmoil there, changing expectations about the employment relationship, both on the employer and the employee side, and organizations need to adapt, right? And who better to help organizations in adapting than the HR function? So the idea here was to gather dozens of thought leaders and industry leaders in HR, so mainly CHROs, but also some leading academics, consultants in this space, to reflect on what do they see in terms of what's happening today and what they see moving forward, what needs to change in organizations, and what does HR need to do differently to rethink the employment relationship, think about how we're managing employees to guide organizations effectively into the future. So the audience for this book very much is future HR leaders. So the idea is to allow them to benefit from the collective wisdom of thought leaders in this space who are seeing today for the first time, right? Like in real time, just like everyone else, what's going on, but have had kind of the benefit of decades of experience through other changes and what it's meant for organizations in HR.
Awesome. So everybody read that book. Read Rebecca's article in HBR, read the recent version of that in the Wall Street Journal. Rebecca, it's always a pleasure working with you at the ILR School and great to connect with you on stage today. I want to thank our audience for joining us. Great questions, everyone. And with that, we'll see you next time on Cornell Keynotes.